When I was little, there was nothing that I wanted to do more than read comic books. But living all the way down here in New Zealand, comics aren't the easiest or most affordable thing to come across. You see, back then it was a lot harder to get your hands on these classic stories. Digital distribution would have been a godsend back in the day. For the longest time, especially in my early teens, the most consistent sources of information that I had on this kind of stuff were like video games that I rented out from the local video store. I remember the X-Men Legends and Marvel Ultimate Alliance games were pretty big for me. But I'm supposedly an adult now, and we're in the glorious age of digital comics. So all you gotta do, log on to Comixology and you're just like, you have decades and decades worth of material right there at your fingertips. And so I welcome you to join me as we explore the stories of one of the most beloved superheroes of all time. This is the Lexicon of Lore, and these are the adventures of the Amazing Spider-Man. What we're going to do is start at the very beginning of the comics run and go from there. I'm aware that down the line the numbering gets somewhat confusing, as the numbering was relaunched a number of times. Spidey gets heavily involved in a lot of event comics, crossovers, there's a whole bunch of miniseries, and I guess that if I ever get that far, I'll worry about it then. I'm going into this completely blind. I'm still relatively inexperienced when it comes to Marvel comics and Western comics in general. To be honest, up until like the last couple of years, I've mostly been a manga reader, so this is all kind of new for me. So I kind of consider this a newcomer's perspective on the classic comic books there. What I want to do is talk about the comics themselves, but I would be remiss if we didn't discuss the history surrounding the character. The controversy surrounding the creation of Spider-Man is complicated, and it centers around probably three of, if not the most famous names in all of comics. We have Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko. Over the years, each of these three men has claimed that they were the ones who crafted the aspects of Spider-Man's design, character, concept, and the story behind this is very long and complicated, and I want to keep this video, at least somewhat on track. So to keep this brief, I'll say this. Lee insisted that he created the character concept. He states that while trying to come up with a new superhero, he was inspired by an old Pulp Fiction hero called the Spider. Ditko insists that Lee only came up with the name, while Ditko himself came up with everything else about the character. Kirby insists that he came up with everything before the project was eventually handed over to Lee and Ditko. It's a very complicated and very messy thing to untangle, and a lot of people have said a lot of different things over the years, and to be perfectly honest, that story could probably fill up an entire video on its own, and I kind of want to focus on the comics there. Spider-Man is often cited as the first teenage superhero, which isn't, it's not technically true. Debuting a few years before Spider-Man did, we have the Legion of Superheroes, an entire team of teenagers, but again, they didn't really work solo. Also, unlike Spider-Man, they didn't really focus on the personal problems of the team members, at least not to the extent that Spider-Man did. We have Johnny Storm of the Fantastic Four, aka the Human Torch. He's also a teenager, but he didn't work solo, he only really worked on a team. But there was a teenage superhero who did get his own solo book before Spider-Man did, which is Robin. However, Robin, even though it was a solo series, he was still created and primarily existed as a sidekick to Batman. So while teenage superheroes did exist before Spider-Man, Spider-Man's really the one who popularized it. As a side note, in the first volume of Spider-Man's Marvel Masterworks, Stan Lee mentions, as kind of an off-handed joke, that maybe he should have called him Bumblebee Man, who would shoot honey instead of web. And funnily enough, I did manage to find a superhero called Bumblebee Man, who debuted a few years after Spidey. This isn't relevant at all to the retrospective, I just think it's kind of funny. I mean, take a good look at this. I mean, this could have been the guy we got instead of Spider-Man. Now, back in the day, a lot of characters got their start in anthology comics. These were collections of different stories, and were like a lot more common back then than they are now. Well, unless you count manga, where the stuff is still the norm to this day. Most of the long-running superheroes we have nowadays got their start in these sorts of mags. Thor got his in Journey into Mystery, Doctor Strange got his in Strange Tales, Superman in Action Comics, Batman in Detective Comics. You get the idea. I understand that for a lot of comic book fans, this kind of stuff is common knowledge, but you never know who's listening, and I figured that I may as well include it on the off chance that someone doesn't know about these sorts of things. Which brings us on to Spider-Man, who got his start in Amazing Fantasy number 15. Now, this issue primarily covers Spidey's origin, which I'm not gonna, repeat here verbatim because I imagine that Spider-Man has one of, if not the most famous origin story in all of fiction, so I'll mostly be skipping over this. But for a quick recap, Peter Parker is a nerdy outsider, he gets picked on constantly by his classmates, he has a loving relationship with his Aunt May and Uncle Ben, he gets bitten by a radioactive spider, gains superpowers, and as a result of his own inaction, his Uncle Ben is killed, therefore learning that with great power comes great responsibility. And right off the bat we get Spidey's iconic costume, which has stayed pretty consistent right up until the modern day. Sure, the webbing between his arms and bodies have been changed in and out, little bits have been tweaked here and there, he's gained new suits altogether, but you know, we always seem to come back to this iconic design. You don't always get this with superheroes' original costumes, like the Blue Beetle started out as a ripoff of the Green Hornet, Doctor Strange didn't have his iconic red cloak, the Incredible Hulk was grey instead of green, but it's really cool that Ditko managed to nail this design on the first go, and to be honest, it's a really nice costume. Like, there's a reason why this hasn't been changed. It's a good mixture of the blue and the red, nothing really overpowers it, you get the spider motif right away without it being too overt, it's a really nice costume. But back to the origin story itself, it's nice to see that after all this time, no matter how many retellings that his origin has had, it more or less remains the same. Sure, details across different adaptations have changed here and there, but basic elements and the overall spirit and message of this, you know, with great power comes great responsibility, the spirit of it stays true. And as a bit of trivia, with great power, with great responsibility is something that would later be attributed to Uncle Ben, but here, funnily enough, it's just said in like this narration box, being said by like, I don't know, the disembodied voice of the narrator, which I thought was kind of amusing. And something that I do want to touch on before we get into the numbered issues themselves. After the success of Spidey's debut in Amazing Fantasy, Lee and Ditko were given the go-ahead to create Spidey's very own solo series. Dubbed The Amazing Spider-Man, the issue dropped a full year after his appearance in Amazing Fantasy. With there being such a big gap between his debut, his origin is retold in the first issue. Now, the origin story told here is tweaked ever so slightly. Instead of it being that through Spidey letting a criminal go, he inadvertently allowed Uncle Ben to die, it's changed to he was late to save Uncle Ben because he was too busy out showing off. This isn't really something that sticks, and it is changed almost immediately in like, I think issue 10, and then it's retold in like issue 50, so it's not really something to get upset about. Issue 1 is split into two different stories. In the first tale, Peter and Aunt May are struggling financially now that Uncle Ben is gone, so Peter sets out to make some money. Peter tries entertaining people with his newfound powers. Unfortunately, none of the promoters want to do business with him. All thanks to the editor-in-chief of the Daily Bugle, and let's be honest, one of the most well-known Spider-Man characters out there, J. Jonah Jameson, who views Spider-Man as a public menace. Later we see JJ standing by with his son, John Jameson III, preparing to test pilot a new rocket. This story was written in '63, by the way, so the space race was in full swing at this point. You get that? So the rocket launch ends up going wrong, and of course, Spidey has to step in and save the day. Once he does, Jameson of course shows his usual grace and gratitude by trashing Spider-Man, claiming that he tampered with the rocket just so he could save the day. Our second story involves Spidey's first encounter with a chameleon, who just so happens to be the first supervillain he ever fought. Still desperate and looking for money, Peter tries to join up with the Fantastic Four. Like a typical teenager, he doesn't think his plan through all the way and tries to break into the Baxter building. This goes about as well as you would expect, and after a brief altercation, Peter finds out that the Four are non-profit anyway. After he's accused of being wanted by the police, he storms out. After the chameleon hears about this, he uses this to his advantage and decides to frame Spidey for his next robbery. He breaks into the Baxter building disguised as Spider-Man and makes off with their secrets, intending to sell them off to the Soviets. You get that with a lot of stories from the 60s, the space race comes up a lot, same with like Red Scare kind of stuff. To cut a long story short, Spidey manages to get to the chameleon in time and stop him, closing out Spider-Man's very first solo issue. This first solo issue establishes several important aspects for Spider-Man's character, stuff that we still see playing out to this day, such as how his fights tend to go against supervillains, his constant financial struggles, dealing with bullying at school, and of course the constant public distrust and ridicule egged on and often instigated by longtime Spider-Man supporting character J. Jonah Jameson. Now, over the years, a lot of different reasons will be given why he hates Spider-Man so so much. In this first issue, all that we really get is that he doesn't want young children emulating Spider-Man, and he'd rather that kids would look up to his own son. Later on in Amazing Spider-Man number 10, it would be because Jameson is just jealous. He's been a person who's always in it for the money, so he's jealous of Spider-Man, you know, for going out there and doing this all and being a hero all free of charge. Later it would be something like he just wants to keep Spider-Man in check. I think like way down the line in Amazing Fantasy number 18, he's mad at Spidey because his son got bumped from a talk show or something like that. A lot of things in comics get changed and retconned over the years, and Jameson himself is no exception. Now, for a lot of these early issues, they're pretty formulaic, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip over large chunks of them just so that I'm not getting too repetitive here. I'll go over any interesting points or any character development stuff as they come up. To use issue 2 as an example here, we're introduced to the Vulture, who's going around committing crimes, stealing things. Peter himself is dealing with money problems again, so he hits upon the idea of taking pictures of the Vulture because Jameson is offering big money for that. Peter fights him midway through the issue. The Vulture manages to beat him. Peter invents a gadget, a magnetic field inverter, to mess with the Vulture's wings. He comes back at the end of the issue, uses his gadget, wins the day, and sells the photos to JJ to make the money. That's more or less the kind of formula we have for a lot of these issues going forward. Issue number 2 also features a side story with the Tinkerer. Not a lot that I really need to cover here. It's again standard villain plot. However, of note is that apparently the Tinkerer is an alien here. I didn't think he was. Like, it's heavily implied that he's an alien. It's kind of confusing because there's dialogue that suggests that he might not be, but then there's other dialogue which definitely suggests that he is. And at the end, Spidey manages to pull off the Tinkerer's rubber face. We don't see an alien face, we just see, you know, the old man face that the Tinkerer was wearing. Now, I went ahead, I'm not super familiar with the Tinkerer, okay? But I double checked, you know, read a few later issues, read on the wiki, all that sort of stuff. And as far as I can tell, the Tinkerer is just a regular human. So I guess it isn't really worth getting worked up all over. Next is Peter's first encounter with one of his most famous villains, Dr. Otto Octavius, aka Dr. Octopus. While this does follow the standard Monster of the Week styled plot, this does have a few more interesting points to it. Unlike the other villains so far, rather than simply going out and committing crimes of his own volition, he does it because he ends up in a lab experiment that fuses a set of mechanical limbs to his body, and these end up driving him insane. Also of note is that halfway through this issue, Peter actually considers giving up being Spider-Man after getting beaten down by Doc Ock so badly, but in a surprise visit to his school, Johnny Storm, aka the Human Torch, inspires Peter to go off and fight Doc Ock again and continue being Spider-Man. I don't know, I just find it kind of wholesome that he's just inadvertently been inspired by a fellow teenage hero. Our next issue sees the first appearance of the Sandman, a villain with the ability to turn his body into sand. Okay, you know, pretty self-explanatory there. He also got his powers in a science accident, but unlike Doc Ock, he was already like a runaway criminal who tried to hide in a nuclear testing site. Issue 5 continues to stick to this villain formula, although instead of introducing a new villain, we get an already established one, the arch nemesis of the Fantastic Four, Dr. Doom himself. I gotta be honest, like, because up until now, the issues have been kind of samey, kind of repetitive, but I really like this issue. It was a lot of goddamn fun. And again, a lot of it's because I just love Dr. Doom, so anything he appears in I'll probably enjoy. But it's a genuinely good issue. Like, there's a lot of back and forth. We get, of course, a lot of Dr. Doom's over-the-top, hammy dialogue. So the first half of this issue focuses on Doom's efforts to recruit Spider-Man, which then quickly devolves into a brawl between the two when Spider-Man refuses. And the latter half of the comic involves Doom trying to kidnap Spidey to lure in the Fantastic Four to save him. But he ends up kidnapping Flash Thompson instead, who's dressed as Spider-Man, and I haven't brought up Flash Thompson until now, but he's another long-time supporting Spider-Man character. He starts out as, you know, your prototypical bully character. He's there to make Peter's life miserable. He's really mean towards him, but as things go along and as Flash's character begins to develop, Flash ends up becoming friends with Peter later on. But in terms of Flash's character for this issue, what we get is the establishment that Flash is actually a big fan of Spider-Man. Over the next few issues, we see confrontations with more villains, from the first appearance of the Lizard, where Peter travels all the way to Florida and defeats him by returning to the Lizard to their human form. We also see the return of the Vulture, Spidey's first returning villain, and Peter has to defeat the Vulture while having a broken arm. I feel like this is a good point to mention that going back and reading these classic comics takes some getting used to, like from a modern reader's perspective, as there's generally a lot more text and dialogue per panel. Often pages will be crowded with large word balloons that take up most of the panel. We get redundant dialogue and narration that state what the art is depicting anyway. It makes for one of the biggest stylistic differences between modern and classic comics. I believe classic comics were done this way for two possible reasons. One, because superhero mags were often aimed at a younger audience and they wanted to make the action more explicit and they felt like they had to spell things out. And two, even though comics had been created a couple of decades before, this was still a relatively immature medium and they were still developing the techniques necessary to convey the information that they wanted to convey. And over time, we'd get people becoming more comfortable with how things work, understanding how to best implement a show don't tell mentality, but in comic form. In our next story, we see the first appearance of the Living Brain in an admittedly weak issue. I've been enjoying the stories up until now, but this one really didn't click for me. I honestly think it's because of the Living Brain itself. It's a robot with no real will or goal of its own. It's just kind of a robot, and I didn't find that very compelling. And the thieves who steal it, they're just generic criminals. They don't really have a gimmick or, any interesting character to them. I'm aware they do some different stuff with the Living Brain down the line. Like, I think Doc Ock downloads his mind into it at one point. I think the Living Brain also hosts like a Spider-Man trivia night. I don't know. Maybe I'll like the later stuff more, but for now, this wasn't really doing it for me. But what is interesting in this issue is that we get a boxing match between Peter and Flash Thompson. And admittedly, it's pretty fun to watch Peter knocking around Flash while trying to hide his powers. This issue also has a bonus story where Spider-Man fights the Fantastic Four. It's alright. I mean, the fight itself is pretty cool, but the way they get into the fight is because Peter is jealous of Johnny Storm's girlfriend, so Peter just decides to be a colossal dick about it. And yeah, again, fight is cool. I just wish that they could have gotten into the fight without Spider-Man being a massive tool. Our next story is the introduction of Electro, which is standard fare for these early stories, but it still has some interesting points to it. We see Peter trying to pay for Aunt May's surgery, one of the many times Aunt May will find herself on death's door for the sake of drama. Electro's plan for this involves breaking a bunch of crooks out of jail to kind of start up his own gang. So the issue ends with the day saved, Peter's defeated Electro, he's got all the crooks back into prison, and in a surprising twist, he actually manages to have a positive interaction with a woman that doesn't end with him embarrassing himself. He ends up getting together with Betty Brandt, a fellow employee at the Daily Bugle. They've been kind of flirty back and forth, and they'd kind of hinted at some stuff before. I didn't bring it up until now because, to be honest, until now it really wasn't relevant. After this, we get an introduction to the Enforcers. Definitely not as famous as some of the villains we've covered so far, but they appear somewhat regularly, and I still consider them an important part of the Spider-Man mythos. They're a group of criminals, each with a special talent. They consist of Montana, a southern gentleman who fights with a lasso, Ox, a large man built like a semi-truck, and Fancy Dan, who has the greatest name. He's small, but he's like a really skilled martial artist. They frequently work under someone going by the alias Big Man, an intelligent crime lord who goes around in a mask and fedora. But they've worked for other crime lords as well, like the Green Goblin or the Kingpin. At the end of this tale, it's revealed that the Big Man is Foswell, a fellow employee at the Daily Bugle. He grew sick of working under Jameson and turned to crime, thus starting the trend of Jameson unintentionally creating supervillains. At first, I didn't think Foswell would be all that important. I thought he'd be like a, one-and-done crook. They capture him, put him in prison. But after looking him up, he does feature in a number of storylines down the road. Not just with the creation of the Big Man identity, but his children would take up the mantle as well. This issue also brings us the apparent true reason of why Jameson hates Spider-Man. As mentioned previously, this has been changed several times, but here it's asserted is because Jameson is jealous of Spidey. He's a man who's always out to make money, but Spider-Man is someone who will gladly go out of his way to help people with no thought of reward, and that is something Jameson just cannot stand. I know Jameson is typically portrayed in a negative light, but I've got to admit, I've got a big soft spot for the guy. I think this is mostly due to J.K. Simmons' portrayal of him in the Sam Raimi movies. He's just a lot of goddamn fun. But I do know that later on Jameson will be portrayed in a more sympathetic light. We see that he has a rough childhood, that he's had to work really hard for a lot of the things that we've got. We kind of saw this earlier when the Vulture tried to rob the Bugle, where Jameson begs the Vulture not to rob him because of all the hard work he's put into building the Bugle. Peter thinks that this is because Jameson is a cheapskate, but I prefer to interpret it as Jameson just genuinely cares about the business and all the hard work that he's put in. And despite what he says, that he's got a bit of a soft spot for his employees employees as well. And while he hates Spider-Man, he has nothing but admiration for other heroes. I think Captain America in particular is one that he admires. He believes that Spider-Man's vigilantism is taking credit away from the people he considers true heroes. We've seen bits of this already with how he wanted people to look up to his son rather than Spider-Man. I think he's also like a really staunch supporter of mutant rights as well, and was openly critical of the Mutant Registration Act. But I don't know, maybe this is just me reading into it too much, but I'm just a big sucker for characters who, jerks with a heart of gold. That's kind of one of my favorite character archetypes. Kicking off issue 11 is the return of Dr. Octopus in the first multi-issue story in the comics run. It's only 2 issues, but up until now we've only had single-issue stories, and truth be told, it's a fun story. Doc Ock is released from prison, Peter sees him getting into a car with Betty Brant, making Peter both worried and suspicious, so Peter bugs his car with a tracker. Although this isn't really necessary, since Matt conveniently flies out of the car and lets Peter know where they're going. It turns out Betty is being forced to work for mobsters to try and pay off her brother's gambling debts. Peter manages to make his way to Philly and save Betty, but unfortunately her brother is killed in the fight, and Doc Ock manages to escape. The next issue promises the return of Dr. Octopus and the public unmasking of Spider-Man, and it's pretty obvious to a modern reader that this will not stick at all. I get it, this is to sell copies, you put, Spider-Man's gonna reveal his secret identity in this, and that's something that would sell copies back in the day, and I didn't like how they handled it. I thought it was genuinely pretty weak. Like, I expected something to happen, like he would be unmasked, and then, oh, wait, no, there's actually Spider-Man, it was never the real Spider-Man, or like a memory wipe or something, or I would at least expect the unmasking to last for a lot longer than it did. What happens is that his mask is taken off, and then in literally the next panel, they're like, oh no, it's Peter Parker. He can't be Spider-Man. He isn't Spider-Man. Because in this story, the only reason why they don't believe that Peter Parker is Spider-Man is because Peter has a cold and wasn't able to fight as well. It's just, I don't know. I know that there's a lot of Spider-Man unmasked stories that would come out over the years, but this has got to be one of the weaker ones. So after Peter manages to nab Dr. Octopus again, in our next story, we get the first appearance of Mysterio. The issue opens up with Spider-Man committing crimes, and while this obviously isn't Spider-Man, I do kind of like that they leave it for a little bit, and they even try to tease that maybe this is like a split personality that Peter has, and he even meets up with a psychiatrist at one point. I do like that they just kind of, stretch that out a little bit. And from there, it follows the standard procedure of they introduce the villain, Spidey loses against him the first time, and he comes back and beats him at the end of the chapter. But, all in all, having him be like the fake Spider-Man and showing off all of these cool gadgets he has to fake having magic powers, I thought that was pretty cool. So yeah, this is a nice way to bring Mysterio into the story. And also of note is that while everyone is believing that Spider-Man is a criminal, Flash is standing up for him, claiming he can't be, which is, again, playing into the irony that Flash hates Peter, loves Spider-Man, and all that. Also, the issue ends with Spider-Man webbing Jameson to the ceiling, and I don't know, I just think it's kind of funny. The final issue we will be covering today sets the stage for the comic's first long-running storyline and introduces us to the Green Goblin, arguably Spider-Man's biggest villain. We open up on the Goblin preparing his gadgets and costume while cloaked in shadow. He meets up with the Enforcers and they all agree to take down Spider-Man together. Goblin's plan is to convince a movie producer to shoot a script starring him and Spider-Man, a plan that is ridiculous for a number of reasons. I don't care, it's the Silver Age, this is funny, I think it's great. And if we ignore the implausibility of getting 2 masked lunatics to get a movie produced, it's kind of clever in its own dumb way, because they're shooting in the middle of the Californian desert, and Goblin convinces Spidey to separate from the crew with him and the Enforcers to do a bit of like a rehearsal, and Spidey even notes, oh wow, those guys look just like the Enforcers. Their plan is just to get him alone in the middle of the desert and then just beat the shit out of him. I mean, it's straightforward, but it's not a bad idea. Spider-Man escapes into a nearby cave, but the Enforcers and the Green Goblin block the entrance with a giant boulder. Spidey manages to take down one of the Enforcers in an almost Batman-esque maneuver, but then the Goblin just starts chucking grenades at him, which I do love how the Goblin's go-to strategy is just to throw explosives. Unfortunately, those explosions wake up the cave's resident, the Incredible Hulk. So he just kind of comes in out of nowhere and just starts smashing up the place. Spidey tricks the Hulk into smashing open the cave entrance so he can escape. So Spidey and Goblin start fighting again, but it's cut short because, the Hulk. So Spidey escapes, the Goblin gets away, and the producer is distraught that his production has fallen to pieces, but he gets the brilliant idea to cast the Hulk in his next movie. And I gotta say, that's a pretty strong outing for the first Goblin. Here he's presented as methodical and intelligent. Rather than, jumping in and trying to mix it up with Spidey, he just stays on his glider and throws bombs at him. And the only reason Spidey really survived this encounter is because of the Hulk. I think it was a great decision to keep the identity of the Goblin a secret they commit to for quite a while. You see, this issue was released in July 1964, but the Goblin's identity wouldn't be revealed until a full 2 years later. So in all, a pretty strong issue and a great introduction to what is probably Spider-Man's greatest foe, which I think is a pretty good note to end this video on. And thus ends our first journey into the stories of the Amazing Spider-Man. When we next return, we finish up Peter's time at high school, see the introduction of more iconic villains, and continue the ongoing tyranny of the Green Goblin. And in the next video, we start off with the introduction of the greatest group of villains Spider-Man's ever had, the Sinister Six. This has been the Lexicon of Lore, and I hope to see you next time.